My name is Emily Saunders and I'm 29 years old. I was sitting in the far corner of the law office, back straight, hands folded tightly in my lap. The mahogany table between us seemed too polished, too elegant for what was about to happen. Across from me, my parents wore matching expressions of smug detachment, and my older sister Allison scrolled through her phone like she was already bored of the entire ordeal. We were there for the reading of my grandfather's will. I hadn't spoken much during the funeral, and I hadn't been invited to help with arrangements. That job had gone to Allison, of course. The perfect daughter. The one who lived in New York, worked at a prestigious law firm, and wore her success like a designer coat. I was the disappointment. The black sheep who had left a stable job in finance to start a small sustainable farm project. I lived 3 towns over in a rundown cottage, grew my own vegetables, and sold organic honey at the local farmer's market. My father used to introduce me as our daughter, who's experimenting. Now I was just the one who dropped everything to take care of Grandpa when he got sick. 6 months. I gave up my income, paused my business, slept on a cot in his study so I could monitor his oxygen at night. And still I heard my mother whispering on the phone one day, telling a friend, "She's only doing it because she thinks she'll get something out of it." So as I sat there in that office with their icy stares and Allison's tapping nails, I already knew what they thought. "She'll get nothing," my father muttered as the lawyer stepped into the room. Allison snorted. "Maybe some old books or one of those ugly pocket watches he kept. That's about it." I said nothing. The lawyer, Mr. Raymond Harper, smiled politely and took his seat. He was a man in his 60s with a deep voice and a calm manner that always made me think of antique clocks. He opened a thick envelope and removed several documents, then cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming. As you know, this is the last will and testament of Mr. Thomas Gerald Saunders, executed 2 months before his passing. This document has been verified and is legally binding." "Shall I begin?" "Let's just get on with it," my father said, waving a hand. Mr. Harper nodded, flipped a page, and began reading. "To my daughter, Elaine Saunders, and her husband, Michael, I leave my warmest gratitude and best wishes for the future." My mother blinked. My father's smirk faded slightly. "To my granddaughter, Allison, I leave my vintage wristwatch collection and the framed portrait in my study as a token of the legacy she so carefully crafted in her own image." Allison frowned, glancing up sharply from her phone. "And finally," Miss Harper said, adjusting his glasses, "to my granddaughter, Emily Saunders, who gave me not only care in my final days, but dignity, who reminded me that integrity means doing the right thing even when no one notices. I leave the remainder of my estate." The room went silent. All assets, including my property, investment accounts, business holdings, and real estate, are to be transferred solely to Emily. My father stood up abruptly. "What the hell is this?" Mr. Harper raised a hand calmly. "There is also a personal letter from Mr. Saunders. He requested I read it aloud." As he opened the envelope and unfolded the cream-colored stationery, I sat there frozen. Not triumphant, not angry, just stunned. Because in that moment, I realized that despite everything, despite how they'd treated me, ignored me, doubted me, Grandpa had seen me, really seen me. And now his voice was about to speak from beyond the grave. I didn't always feel like the outsider in my family. Growing up, I was close to my grandfather. We used to sit on the porch of his farmhouse, watching the light change on the hills, while he told me stories from his childhood. He had a quiet strength, worked with his hands, believed in fixing things rather than throwing them away. He was the first person who taught me how to dig potatoes, how to measure the pH level of soil, how to tell when a tomato was ready without touching it. Those memories stayed with me long after the world told me to pursue something more realistic. I studied economics, graduated with honors, got a job at a mid-sized bank downtown. I wore heels, carried a leather laptop bag, made small talk over espresso. My parents approved. So did Allison. But something inside me felt hollow. Every evening I came home and stared at spreadsheets. Every weekend I escaped to farmers markets. I started reading books on permaculture, climate-resilient crops, the food crisis. Eventually, I applied for a grant to start a small sustainable farming initiative, one I planned to launch on unused land outside of town. When I told my parents I was quitting my job, they were horrified. "You're throwing away your future," my mother said, clutching her wine glass like it might slip from her hand. My father didn't say much, just shook his head and muttered something about idealism. Allison was more direct. "You're 27, Emily. This is the time to build a career, not chase Pinterest dreams." But I did it anyway. I moved into a small rental house on the edge of town and started rebuilding the soil. Every day was hard. I worked from sunrise to sunset, hauling compost, adjusting irrigation lines, learning from failure after failure. My hands cracked, my back ached, but I had never felt more awake. I raised chickens, I grew herbs and vegetables. I started selling at markets, offering workshops, collaborating with local schools on garden programs. Slowly, word spread. I began forming partnerships with restaurants and small grocers. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And it was mine. My grandfather visited often. He'd bring me breakfast sandwiches from the diner and sit on an upturned bucket while I weeded rows of kale. He never said much about the rest of the family, but I saw the pride in his eyes when he watched me work. "You're not just planting things," he said once. "You're planting yourself, and I think you're growing strong." Then he got sick. At first it was just fatigue, then trouble breathing. A diagnosis followed: pulmonary fibrosis. Chronic, progressive, no cure. My mother didn't want to deal with it, claimed she was too busy with charity board meetings. My father visited a few times out of obligation, but mostly stayed away. Allison was unreachable, buried in casework and business travel. So I packed a suitcase, paused my business, and moved into Grandpa's farmhouse. For 6 months, I managed his medications, cooked his meals, drove him to appointments. I held his hand when he couldn't sleep and read aloud when his eyesight dimmed. I listened to stories I'd heard 100 times and let them wash over me like familiar music. He never said thank you. He didn't have to. But I overheard him one night whispering to his friend on the phone, "Emily's the only one who stayed. The only one who sees me as a man, not a burden." I never told anyone I heard that. My family didn't visit except once Thanksgiving weekend. They showed up for exactly 90 minutes, took a few pictures, made small talk about his condition, then left. That night, Grandpa didn't eat, just stared out the window silent. And yet when he passed, I wasn't the one who received the call first. My father called me 3 hours later, his tone flat and perfunctory. "Your grandfather passed this morning. The funeral's Friday. Don't be late. No condolences." No mention of the time I'd spent by his side. No warmth. They didn't invite me to help with the arrangements. They excluded me from every discussion about the will. It was as if I didn't exist. I didn't fight it. I grieved quietly back in my small home, returning to my neglected crops and overgrown fields. The world kept moving, life resumed, except now there was an emptiness I didn't know how to fill. That's why when the letter from the lawyer arrived 2 weeks later, I almost didn't open it. I assumed it was a mistake. A formal notice, maybe. I'd already said goodbye, but the envelope was thick, and inside a short handwritten note from Mr. Harper. "Your grandfather made specific requests before his passing. Please attend the reading of his will. Your presence is required." That word "required" sat strangely in my chest. I hadn't been required for anything in this family in years, so I pressed. My only decent blouse, polished my boots, and drove 3 hours back to the town I had left behind. I expected to be ignored, maybe even ridiculed. I didn't expect the entire room to fall silent. When they heard what Grandpa had truly left behind, looking back, I should have seen it coming. The signs were there. 2 weeks before Grandpa passed, I remember catching Allison standing in the hallway outside his bedroom, whispering into her phone. When she saw me, she quickly ended the call and gave me a look that felt like a warning. I brushed it off at the time, thinking maybe it was work-related. But now I can't unhear her saying the words, "Let's just make sure she doesn't get anything complicated." It hadn't occurred to me then that she was talking about me. After Grandpa died, everything happened fast. He passed on a Sunday morning. By Sunday afternoon, Allison had already arranged a private family meeting with a lawyer, just not the one Grandpa had always trusted, Mr. Harper. She chose someone else, a slick corporate attorney from the city who probably charged by the minute and knew how to keep things selective. I wasn't invited to that meeting. I found out about it from a cousin who worked at the courthouse and texted me asking why I wasn't on the distribution list. When I called my mother for clarification, she responded with practiced calm. "Oh, sweetheart, there's really nothing you need to worry about. It's mostly just legal formalities." Grandpa had everything pretty much set up for Allison to manage. "It'll save us all a headache." A headache? I felt a flush rise in my cheeks. After everything, I was reduced to a potential complication, an inconvenience. "I'd still like to be informed," I said. "Of course, darling," she replied. "We'll let you know if anything comes up." They didn't. The funeral was tasteful, brief, and cold. I arrived alone. My parents and Allison sat in the front row. There was no seat saved for me, so I stood at the back of the chapel behind two elderly neighbors who didn't recognize me. Not one of them acknowledged me during the service. Afterward, Allison gave a short eulogy. She mentioned his business sense, his contributions to the community, his values of structure and order. Nothing about his warmth, nothing about the stories he told. Nothing about the man who used to leave apples by the fence for the neighbors' children. When it ended, I lingered by the old maple tree in the cemetery where his ashes would be scattered the next day. I sat on the cold stone bench and cried until the sun began to sink behind the trees. A few feet away, my parents were speaking with some old family friends. I caught snippets of their conversation. "She moved out to that little shack, playing farmer." Mm-hmm. Poor Tom. I'm sure he didn't mean for his last months to be like that. Oh, I'm sure she meant well. I left before they could spot me. The next few days were quiet. I tried to grieve, tried to reconnect with my work. The fields had grown wild weeds pushing up through what used to be neat rows. I spent the mornings pulling thistle, my body aching with the kind of tired that comes from more than just labor. I didn't hear from anyone. Not my parents, not Allison, not the lawyer. That's when I started wondering. I remembered conversations with Grandpa, moments that at the time had seemed casual. "How's the honey business?" he'd ask. "Any progress with that partnership you mentioned? Do you have someone helping you file your taxes?" I'd always answered honestly, if a bit wearily. Running a small business with no family support wasn't easy, but he had always seemed engaged, supportive, even proud. And there was one evening, 2 months before he passed, when he asked me to drive him into town. "I have an appointment," he said, simply slipping on his old brown cardigan and reaching for his cane. "With who?" "Just a friend. Don't worry about it." He didn't let me come inside. He just said wait in the truck and disappeared into an office building on Main Street for almost an hour. Now I know where he went. He met with Mr. Harper. The family had their version of the will carefully crafted and sealed by Allison's attorney. It was cold, efficient, and legal, but it wasn't real. The real will, the one that mattered, was the one Grandpa had prepared that day in the office while I sat in the truck humming along to an old folk song on the radio. And they didn't know about it because they thought I was naive, passive, easy to write off. That assumption cost them everything. But at the time, I didn't know that. At the time, all I knew was that I had been left out. I felt it in 1,000 ways. The lack of phone calls, the subtle exclusion, the condescending tones during the few conversations we did have. When I called to ask when the reading would happen, my mother gave me a vague answer. "I believe it's mostly handled. Allison's taking care of everything." "There's no need for you to worry yourself, Emily." She might as well have said, "You don't matter." I hung up and sat on the floor of my cottage surrounded by unopened mail, unpaid bills, and overripe peaches that had gone soft on the windowsill. I cried that night. Not because I wanted money, not because I felt entitled to anything. I cried because I had given so much. Time, energy, care, everything I had. And they had decided that none of it meant anything. They had rewritten the story in their heads, Emily the flaky one, Emily the dropout, Emily the inconvenience. They had cut me out, not just of the will, but out of the memory of him, out of the narrative they were constructing for the world. And I let them. Until the envelope arrived from Mr. Harper. And I realized my grandfather hadn't forgotten me. He had simply been waiting for the right moment to speak. The envelope sat unopened on my kitchen table for nearly a day. It was heavier than I expected, cream-colored, with my name printed neatly in the center. The return address was the familiar law office, Harper and Denton, downtown. I ran my finger over the raised seal more times than I care to admit before finally breaking it open. Inside was a letter from Mr. Harper and a printed invitation. The letter was brief. Dear Ms. Saunders, your grandfather, Mr. Thomas G. Saunders, left specific instructions requesting your presence for the reading of his will to take place on April 4th at 3:00 p.m. at our office. Your presence is required as you have been named as a primary beneficiary. Sincerely, Raymond Harper. I read it twice. Then a third time. Primary beneficiary. The words didn't compute. I had been conditioned to assume that I wouldn't be in the will at all, that whatever plans my grandfather had made had been carefully swept away by Allison and my parents. But now with this simple letter, everything shifted. I packed the envelope into a folder, pressed my one nice blouse, and ironed my slacks. Then I returned to the field, kneeling in the dirt with a trowel in one hand, mind racing. What had he done? 2 months earlier, I had driven Grandpa into town and waited outside the law office. I'd wondered why he didn't want me to come inside, but he'd smiled and said, I've got a few things to set right. I didn't ask questions. I just sat there with the windows rolled down, watching people walk by, trying to ignore the growing ache in my chest, the ache that knew time was running out. That was the day I now realize he rewrote his will. While my parents and sister were plotting who would inherit the family estate, the land, the investments, the company stock, he was preparing something else entirely. He'd been watching, quietly, for years. He watched me struggle through frost warnings and crop failure, get back up after a rejected business loan, refused to give up when my irrigation system collapsed during a summer drought. He saw more than just effort. He saw intention, purpose, heart, and without saying a word, he put everything in motion. What my family didn't know, what they would soon discover, was that Grandpa had been quietly separating his finances for months. The land had already been removed from joint trusts and placed in a private holding, naming me as the successor. The farm account had been converted to a legacy endowment fund, with my name as trustee. The stocks he owned in an agricultural supply company, all reassigned. And everything was locked down, with clear legal language impossible to dispute. I had never asked him for any of it, never expected it. I assumed he would do what most people do, split things evenly, or give it to the one with the most prestige and connections. Allison, after all, had the right title, the right network, the right polish. But he had chosen something else. I remember him once saying, legacy isn't about who shines the brightest. It's about who keeps the fire going when no one's watching. That was who he believed I was. Not loud, not impressive in a resume sense, but steady, committed, capable. And he trusted me to do something meaningful with what he left behind. The next few weeks passed in quiet preparation. I didn't tell anyone about the letter. I didn't answer Allison's calls when she finally belatedly reached out, likely to gloat or share some strategic update. I didn't reply to my father's generic group text about family matters being settled. I just worked. I fixed the chicken wire fencing. I harvested winter spinach and packed jars of honey for the spring market. I met with a friend from the local food co-op to discuss expansion ideas. I stayed grounded, because that was the only way I knew how to live. But under the surface, a current of anticipation pulled at me. I was nervous not for what I might receive, but for how my family would react. For the explosion I knew was coming. I knew them well enough to know they wouldn't take it with grace. They believed in hierarchy, image, order. In their minds, someone like me didn't deserve to win. But this wasn't about winning. It wasn't about revenge or proving anything. It was about finally being seen, not just for what I had done, but for who I had quietly become. The reading of the will would take place in 2 days. I didn't sleep much the night before. I reread Mr. Harper's letter. I rehearsed ways to stay calm. I reminded myself of what Grandpa had always told me: don't fight people with noise, Em. Let your actions speak. The people who matter will hear you. When I finally walked into the law office that afternoon, the conference room was already full. My parents sat side by side, dressed in somber black, more theatrical than necessary. Allison stood near the window, back straight, phone in hand, looking completely in control. They barely glanced at me when I walked in. "Emily," my mother said curtly. "Didn't think you'd bother coming." I gave a small nod and took a seat near the end of the table. Mr. Harper entered a moment later holding a thick folder, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "Good afternoon, everyone," he said calmly. "Thank you for coming. As per Mr. Saunders' instructions, I'll be reading his will in full. Please hold questions until the end." I sat perfectly still, hands folded, eyes on the polished wood. This wasn't my revenge. This was my reckoning. And I was ready. Mr. Harper adjusted his glasses and opened the thick folder. The weight of his silence filled the room like pressure before a storm. The last will and testament of Mr. Thomas Gerald Saunders, he began, was executed on February 9th, 2 months prior to his passing, in full accordance with state law. It supersedes all previously filed documents and has been reviewed by independent counsel. My father shifted in his seat. My mother gave a polite, tight-lipped smile. Allison looked relaxed, almost smug. No one looked at me. Mr. Harper continued. "This document contains specific bequests, general distributions, and a personal message, which Mr. Saunders requested be read aloud at the end of this session." He flipped to the first page. "To my daughter, Elaine Saunders, and her husband, Michael. Thank you for the years you provided comfort and stability to our family. I leave you the antique grandfather clock in the front hallway and a one-time monetary gift of $25,000 to be withdrawn from my savings account and distributed upon probate." My mother's smile faltered just slightly. 25,000. It was generous, yes, but far less than the value of even 1 acre of Grandpa's land. My father cleared his throat but said nothing. Mr. Harper turned another page. "To my granddaughter, Allison Saunders, I leave the following, my complete wristwatch collection, the framed portrait of your grandmother that hangs in the dining room, and the 1967 red Corvette I kept stored in the barn." Allison blinked. The Corvette was valuable, sure, but still it was far from the business assets or real estate holdings. She shifted her weight and narrowed her eyes. Mr. Harper paused, letting the room settle. And finally he said, voice even to my granddaughter, Emily Saunders. I felt my heart stop. "I leave the entirety of my estate, including but not limited to all farmland and property, located at 1145 Brookwood Lane, all associated equipment and structures, my personal investment accounts, currently valued at $2.7 million, and my 52% ownership stake in Green Valley Supply Company." My ears rang. I stared down at the table, refusing to look at anyone. It wasn't pride I felt. It wasn't triumph. It was weight, responsibility, shock. But across the table I heard an audible gasp. What Allison's voice was sharp, slicing the silence like glass. My mother turned to Mr. Harper. "Excuse me, there must be some kind of mistake." "There is no mistake," Mr. Harper said calmly, flipping to another page. "Mr. Saunders made these arrangements deliberately and with full legal oversight. He barely even talked to her," my father said, his voice rising. "She's been playing farmer for 2 years?" 3, I said quietly, though I didn't expect anyone to hear. "This is ridiculous," Allison snapped. "She's not qualified to manage anything. She has no legal training, no business background. What is she even going to do with Green Valley?" Mr. Harper removed his glasses and folded his hands. "If I may continue, Mr. Saunders left a message to be read aloud at this point." He reached into the folder and pulled out a single cream-colored letter with handwriting I recognized instantly. Grandpa's. Every curve of every letter felt like a memory. Mr. Harper cleared his throat. "To my family, thank you for being here. If you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and I hope you've taken a moment to reflect on a life that, while imperfect, was full of meaning. I want to be clear about something. The decisions I made in this will were not made lightly. They were made after much thought and with the full knowledge of what they might provoke. Elaine Michael, thank you for raising a family and for the holidays and memories. But over the last few years, I noticed your absence. When I got sick, you stayed away. That hurt more than I let on." My mother flinched. "Allison, you are smart-driven and destined for success. But in all your accomplishments, I watched you forget something important: compassion. The way you looked at your sister in recent years, dismissive cold, reminded me of the people who once looked at me the same way when I started with nothing. You're brilliant, but brilliance without humility is just noise. Allison's mouth tightened, her eyes glassy with rage. And Emily, my Emily, you came when no one else did. You listened. You held my hand when it shook. You poured soup when I couldn't lift the spoon. You stayed. But it wasn't just your loyalty, it was your vision, your farm, your work, your values. You're not just growing vegetables. You're building a future, a sustainable one that this town and this world needs. I didn't choose you out of pity. I chose you because you're the only one I trust to carry forward what I spent my life trying to protect. I was crying, quietly, still refusing to look up. To those of you who feel slighted, I offer no apology. Legacy is not an entitlement, it's a torch, and I gave it to the one I believe will carry it with care. Mr. Harper folded the letter gently and slid it back into its envelope. No one spoke. Allison stared at the floor. My father looked like someone had punched him in the chest. My mother was frozen, her lips pressed into a single line. For a long moment, all I heard was the ticking of the clock on the far wall. Finally, Mr. Harper broke the silence. These arrangements are final. All transfers will begin next week. If there are no further questions. I want to contest it, my father said suddenly. You'll find that nearly impossible, Mr. Harper replied calmly. Mr. Saunders underwent 2 separate mental competency evaluations prior to executing the will. His choices were documented and witnessed. Every step was taken to ensure there would be no grounds for dispute. This is absurd, Allison said. Emily doesn't know the first thing about running a company. I looked up for the first time. I know what I care about, I said, voice steady. And that's more than enough to learn the rest. Allison laughed bitterly. You think this makes you better than us? No, I said, standing slowly. I think this makes me seen. They didn't respond. Mr. Harper stood as well and extended a small box toward me. Inside was a single key, Grandpa's office key. This is yours now, he said quietly. I took it with both hands, feeling its weight like a stone and a promise all at once. As I stepped toward the door, I glanced back once, not out of spite, but because part of me still hoped for some recognition, some moment of clarity, a truce. But they weren't looking at me. They were looking at each other, blaming, wounding, falling apart. And I understood in that instant that Grandpa hadn't just left me an inheritance. He had freed me. I walked out of the law office and into the sun. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was walking into something I didn't have to justify. Something I had earned, not with degrees or titles, but with love and with presence. The day after the will was read, I returned to my little farmhouse with a manila envelope tucked under my arm. Inside was the original letter. Mr. Harper had handed it to me at the end of the meeting along with the key and a soft look of sympathy that didn't feel pitying, just human. He wanted you to have this, he'd said. The physical copy. He believed words should be held. That night, I made a cup of tea and sat by the window, the spring wind brushing through the old screen, rustling the paper in my hand. I unfolded it carefully. Grandpa's handwriting was shaky and parts stronger in others. There were ink smudges where he'd probably paused and pressed 2 hard tiny scratches where he'd corrected a word instead of starting a new page. It felt alive. I read it slowly. My dear Emily, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. And knowing you, you're probably holding this with trembling hands and tears in your eyes, trying to make sense of everything. That's just who you are. You feel things all the way through. That's why I've always admired you. Let me say something up front. You didn't ask for any of this, and that's exactly why you deserve it. I watched your journey not as a judge, but as a witness. I saw how the world talked down to you, how your parents rolled their eyes at your choices, how Allison smiled politely while carving you out of every room. I saw you take soil that was cracked and dead and coax it back to life. I saw you build something with your hands, not because it would impress anyone, but because it mattered to you. I paused the paper, trembling just like he predicted. The tea on the table was already cold. Outside, frogs sang their midnight chorus. I kept reading. You remind me of myself more than anyone else in this family. That's probably why we got along so well. I came from nothing, too. When I bought this land, people thought I was a fool. The ground was rocky, the water unreliable. But I saw potential. I didn't need approval. I needed purpose. You understand that better than anyone. I gave you my estate not to punish the others, but because I knew you'd do something worthwhile with it. Not flashy, not for show. Something lasting, something real. They won't understand that. Not now, maybe not ever. That's not your burden. I trust you, Emily, not because you're the smartest or the strongest, but because you show up. You keep promises. You listen. And that means more than money ever will. My throat tightened. I've included instructions in the will, details about the business, about the farm's future, about the nonprofit I hope you'll build someday. But none of that matters as much as this. Take care of yourself. Don't work yourself into the ground trying to prove you earned this. You already did. And when the time comes, pass it on to someone who lives the way you live, with care, with intention, and with grit. Don't fight them, Em. Let them talk. Let them doubt. Then go plant something beautiful. All my love, Grandpa. I folded the letter and held it against my chest. There were 1,000 things I wished I could say to him. Thank you. I'm sorry. I remember. I miss you. But maybe this moment, this quiet space, this house filled with wind and candlelight and soil under my fingernails, maybe this was my reply. I set the letter beside me and opened the old notebook I kept on the table. It was stained and soft, with use pages curling at the corners. I turned to a fresh page and wrote in blocky letters at the top, spring planting schedule. Legacy Season 1. It sounded cheesy even to me, but it felt right. Then I pulled out another page, one Grandpa had drawn for me last year when we'd mapped out the new beekeeping section. He doodled tiny bees in the margins, little arrows showing where the hives would sit, where the flowers would bloom. We never got around to building it, but now I would, because I understood the message behind his letter. He hadn't left me money. He'd left me a direction. And more than anything, he had trusted me to choose what came next. The first phone call came the next morning. It was my mother. Her voice was tight, forced, like she was trying to maintain dignity while the world she'd built was cracking underneath her. Emily, she began without greeting, we need to talk. I said nothing, waiting. I think you understand how difficult yesterday was. For everyone. Still, I stayed quiet. She sighed. This decision of your grandfather's, it's not fair. And while I know you're emotional right now, we should all be thinking practically, realistically, about what I asked, about revisiting the terms she said carefully, about the property, the business. Surely you don't intend to keep all of it. That kind of responsibility isn't something you're equipped for. There it was, the same old tone, the same old message, disguised now as concern. Grandpa thought I was. I said. Silence. Then she tried again. Think about the company, Emily. You have no background in management. Allison could help at least temporarily. You could sign partial rights over to her. We could. No. I said it calmly. Not cruelly, just firmly enough to end the conversation. Her voice sharpened. Don't be foolish. You're making an emotional decision and it's going to damage this family beyond repair. No, I repeated. I'm honoring Grandpa's wishes. The line went silent for a few seconds. Then I see. She hung up without saying goodbye. I knew more would come. And they did. Allison emailed me 3 pages of typed objections citing my lack of experience, my impractical lifestyle, and what she called unfortunate emotional instability. It was written like a legal memo. She copied 2 lawyers on it. One was hers. The other used to be Grandpa's before he'd switched to Mr. Harper. She also left me a voicemail. You might think this is justice, Emily, but it's not. It's favoritism. He was old and confused. You manipulated him when he was vulnerable, and you're benefiting from it. You can either come to the table and negotiate, or this gets messy. I didn't respond. I forwarded everything to Mr. Harper, who called me back that afternoon. I've reviewed their materials, he said. They don't have a case. The will is airtight. Every asset transfer has already begun. But I won't sugarcoat it, they'll keep coming. Let them, I said. There was a pause. You're handling this with grace, he said. I wasn't sure if I was, but I knew I wasn't going to back down. The following week, my father showed up at the farm. I hadn't seen him since the funeral. He pulled up in his gray SUV, stepped out in polished shoes, completely unsuited for gravel, and walked up to the porch like he still owned the place. I didn't invite him in. I stood in the doorway. He looked around. This place looks smaller than I remember. It's the same size it's always been, I said. He shifted uncomfortably. I know your grandfather meant well, but he didn't always understand the bigger picture. We've kept this family together for decades. He shouldn't have. He did what he wanted, I said. He knew what he was doing. He stepped closer. This isn't how families work, Emily. We don't cut each other out. You already did, I replied. For a moment, I saw something flicker in his expression, regret. Shame I couldn't tell. He turned back toward his car. You'll regret this someday, he said. No, I said quietly. I already regretted letting you treat me like I didn't matter. I'm done with that now. He didn't say another word. He drove away. And I exhaled, not in relief exactly, but in clarity. I hadn't fought them, I hadn't lashed out, I hadn't sought revenge, but I had protected what was mine. And for once, I didn't feel like the forgotten daughter. I felt like the one who had finally taken root. Spring came quickly that year. Within weeks, the fields behind the farmhouse turned from brittle gray to soft green. I planted rows of heirloom tomatoes, purple carrots, and golden beets. I added lavender by the fence, partly for the bees, partly because Grandpa liked the way it smelled in the kitchen window. Every morning I woke before sunrise and walked the property with a notebook in hand, just like he used to. I checked the moisture in the soil, counted the early sprouts, made small adjustments to the composting system we had designed together. But it wasn't just a farm anymore. It was becoming something larger. With the inheritance, I was able to buy 2 adjacent lots previously marked for development. I donated one of them to a local food cooperative and began working with a regional nonprofit to build a small training center for young farmers. The idea was simple: teach people how to grow food in a way that heals the land in their lives. I called it the Legacy Project. It wasn't flashy. There was no ribbon cutting or media campaign, just a group of volunteers, a few solar panels, a used greenhouse, and the soft hum of possibility. One afternoon, I stood in what used to be Grandpa's old storage shed, now converted into a tiny office, and opened a drawer he'd labeled personal. Inside, I found a folded index card with a single line written in his unmistakable handwriting. Character over credentials. Always. I smiled, tears blurring the ink. In that moment, I understood what his gift really was. He hadn't given me money. He'd given me back my voice. For so many years, I had been quiet, unsure, afraid of taking up too much space in a family that only saw value in perfection. But now every tomato I planted, every teen I mentored, every seed I shared, it was all proof that my quiet had never been weakness. It was just waiting for the right moment to grow. Sometimes I think about Allison, about my parents, about how they've chosen silence since that day in the law office. I don't hate them. I don't need to, because I've learned something Grandpa tried to teach me long ago on a hot August day when we sat drinking lemonade in the shade. Forgiveness, he said, isn't about who's right. It's about who refuses to let bitterness be the last thing growing. So I forgave them not for their sake, but for mine. I still get asked how I did it, how I stayed calm, how I handled it all. The answer is simple. I remembered who I was before they told me I was less, and I let that person bloom.